Hello, and welcome back to our men's Bible study lesson on Matthew chapter 24. I'm Casper, giving this week's teaching again. This week and the next, we study a new theme in the Gospel of Matthew, the Olivet Discourse, in chapters 24 and 25. This is the fifth and final discourse that Jesus gives as recorded in this Gospel. The events of the Holy Week continue to unfold in ways that have astounded the disciples. Jesus entered Jerusalem on Sunday with what seemed triumphant acclaim from the crowds as the arriving Messiah. But after disrupting the commercial activity in the temple on Monday, things took an ominous turn. The entire Tuesday morning, Jesus engaged in controversies and debates with the religious leaders. Jesus gave public warning to the crowds and disciples about the teachers of the law and the Pharisees. He condemned the religious leaders, pronouncing woes on them. Now his disciples can see that the week in Jerusalem will be dangerous because the religious leaders are determined to silence Jesus. So Jesus urgently turns his attention to his disciples. He can perceive the coming crisis of his arrest, so he must prepare his followers for the events that await them. For the fifth and final time in Matthew's Gospel, he directs a major discourse to the disciples that will comprise part of what all new disciples will be taught to obey. This discourse is prophecy to prepare his disciples both for catastrophic events of judgment that will happen to the nation, the destruction of the temple, and for the interval before his return in glory and triumph. Few chapters of the Bible have elicited more disagreement among interpreters than Matthew 24, along with its parallels in Mark 13 and Luke 21. The history of the interpretation of this chapter is immensely complex, according to D.A. Carson in his commentary on Matthew. At one extreme are those who interpret chapter 24 as events prophesied by Jesus as being fulfilled in the first century, primarily with the fall of Jerusalem and destruction of the temple in AD 70. This view is largely based on the historical events that did occur leading up to the temple destruction, as Jesus described in his prophecy. At the other extreme is the futurist view that suggests that virtually all the events of the discourse are fulfilled in the future when Israel is once again re-established in God's purposes. This interpretation sees the fulfillment of prophetic passages like Daniel 9 and 12 as parallel prophetic messages. Many who hold this view suggest the church is raptured before the Great Tribulation and Israel is once again restored as a holy nation. A third interpretation takes a mediating position, an intertwining of historical and eschatological fulfillment. Events are partially fulfilled with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple that culminate in the events surrounding the return of Jesus, such as the abomination that causes desolation in the end of the ages. This view has been adopted by a wide range of interpreters, in particular a majority of conservative sources. The Olivet Discourse begins when the disciples point out the beautiful buildings to Jesus in Jerusalem. What massive stones, they exclaim. We see this in Mark 13, verse 1. But Jesus replies that this temple will be destroyed, there will not be left one stone upon another. The disciples ask him, when will these things be? And what are the signs of the end of the age? And what will be the sign of Jesus' coming again? Firstly, Jesus describes events that will occur which are not signs indicating the end of the age is about to happen, such as false messiahs in verse 4 and 5, wars and calamities in verses 6 and 7. These will take place through the ages, but are only the beginning of birth pains. See verse 8. Periods of wars and rumors of wars, tragic earthquakes and famines will wash over the landscape of history in repeated pains. Each reminds us that the end is coming, but no one knows when until the Son of Man appears. Throughout the labor pains, we must remain on guard. Some will try to mislead believers that these pains are the end, but Jesus warns his disciples not to be deceived. Verse 4. Jesus then tells his disciples to be ready for suffering and persecution. Jesus' disciples will have the privilege of carrying his name, but it also brings with it suffering, because the antagonism and hatred that is directed at Jesus will naturally fall on his followers. See this in verses 9 to 11. Because of persecution, the faith of Jesus' followers will be tested. Many will turn away and betray each other. Verse 10. False prophets will arise within the community to try to deceive Jesus' disciples. Verse 11. There will be much wickedness and love will be cold. Verse 12. But Jesus gives a critical promise, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. Verse 13. Having cautioned the disciples against false assumptions about what will signal the end, Jesus now gives an explicit indicator of what must be accomplished before the end of the age. Jesus states, "This gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." In verses 15 to 28, Jesus now points to an event prophesied in Daniel 9, verse 27, the abomination that causes desolation. Some contend that at this point, Jesus focuses exclusively on the destruction of the temple in AD 70, while a wide spectrum of scholars hold that these events also foretell a future time of eschatological defilement and destruction. This last view is supported when compared with Paul's prediction of the eschatological man of lawlessness in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 to 2, and with John's vision of the beast in Revelations chapter 13, verses 11 to 18. These are remarkably similar to Jesus' prophecy. Together, they indicate that some evil deified figure, such as the Antichrist, will come. This will be a period of great suffering. If those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved, the text tells us. This is a way of indicating that God is in control even of those days of horror. The phrase, "immediately after the tribulation of those days," introduces a sequence of events in time. The Son of Man will come after that time of tribulation. We see this in verses 29 to 31. There will be heavenly disturbances, such as darkened skies and falling stars. There will be heavenly appearances, the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, and his angels will gather the elect who belong to Christ. A switch of emphasis now occurs in the remaining verses 32 to 51 of this chapter. Up to this point, there has been a combination of historical and eschatological features in answer to the question about the destruction of the temple and Jesus' return and the end of the age. And now Jesus deals with attitudes that should characterize those who live during this age and await his coming. He gives several lessons to equip people to prepare for the end. The first is the parabolic lesson of the fig tree. Just as you know that summer is near, when the fig tree becomes tender and puts out its branches, when the beginning of the stressful times occurs and the worldwide proclamation of the gospel of the kingdom is accomplished, then disciples should stay alert that the end may be imminent. Jesus speaks of, "This generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened." Interpreters have wrestled with the meaning of this text. Perhaps a twofold reference is best seen here. The disciples to whom Jesus is speaking on the Mount of Olives fits naturally with this generation that sees the events of the destruction of the temple at the same time. It also refers to those at the end of the age who see the events surrounding the abomination of desolation occurring. In the final words of this section, Jesus gives the second lesson, a profound word of assurance to all those looking down the corridors of history and seeing the incredible events he has just described. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Jesus' teachings have divine authority. Jesus' rock-solid prophecy of his return to establish his kingdom provides the assurance needed by his disciples to maintain hope. The third lesson will be expanded in the rest of this discourse in chapter 25 to encourage disciples to wait alertly and in expectation of reward, but also to warn the unprepared and unrepentant about judgment. In closing, we remember the words of Hebrews 12, verses 1 to 2, which follows the list of all those who remained faithful to God, from Abel through to those persecuted by the Roman Empire. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings closely. And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking for Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God.